If your mind keeps returning to them, it is not because you are weak. If their memory appears in silence, it is not because you failed to let go. Zen teaches something most people never hear. The mind does not cling to people, it clings to the feeling it once touched. That is why, even when life moves forward, your thoughts quietly walk backward. Peace does not disappear when someone leaves. Peace disappears when clinging begins. Stay with me, because once you see why the mind holds on, you will no longer need to force yourself to forget, and peace will return naturally, without effort, without struggle. The mind does not miss people, it misses attachment. In Zen psychology, the mind is never disturbed by absence itself. What unsettles the mind is not that someone has left, but that the image the mind built around them no longer matches reality. When you think you are missing a person, what you are actually experiencing is the mind searching for a familiar emotional structure that once made life feel stable, predictable, or complete. The mind does not attach to bodies or names. It attaches to sensations. It attaches to how it felt to be seen, how it felt to be chosen, how it felt to belong to a story that seemed to promise continuity. When that structure disappears, the mind does not immediately understand that life has simply changed. Instead, it interprets the change as loss, and loss as danger. From that moment on, thoughts begin to circle, not because the person was extraordinary, but because the attachment was never examined. Zen teaches that the mind creates images and then forgets it created them. It remembers the warmth but forgets the conditions that produced it. It remembers the comfort but ignores the impermanence that was always present. This is why memories return without invitation. They are not asking you to go back. They are asking to be understood. The mind is attempting to restore a feeling of safety by replaying moments it believes once provided. What most people call longing is, in Zen understanding, unresolved grasping. The mind is still holding an expectation that something external was responsible for inner peace. As long as this belief remains unexamined, thoughts will continue to return gently but persistently, like waves revisiting the same shore. The repetition is not punishment. It is the mind's way of pointing toward a misunderstanding. When you begin to see this clearly, something important shifts. You realize that the pain is not evidence of love, and it is not proof of destiny. It is simply the natural response of a mind that has not yet recognized that peace was never located in another person. This realization does not erase memory, but it loosens its grip. And in that loosening, the first quiet space of peace begins to reappear. Why the mind repeats what has already ended. Once the mind loosens its grip slightly and begins to see that it was not missing a person, but clinging to a feeling, a deeper question naturally arises. If this understanding is true, then why do the thoughts still return so vividly, sometimes without warning, sometimes with such emotional force, that the body reacts before awareness has time to respond? Zen psychology answers this by pointing not to memory, but to habit. The mind is a creature of repetition. It learns through patterns, and it seeks continuity even when continuity no longer exists. When something meaningful ends, the mind does not immediately update its internal map. Instead, it continues to walk familiar paths because those paths once led to relief, comfort, or a sense of wholeness. Thoughts repeat not because the past is calling, but because the mind has not yet learned a new way to feel safe in the present. In Buddhist understanding, this repetition is known as mental conditioning. Every moment shared, every emotional exchange, every expectation quietly reinforced a pattern. Over time, the mind learned to associate certain thoughts with stability and certain images with reassurance. When the external condition disappears, the conditioning remains. The mind then attempts to recreate the missing condition internally through thought, imagination, and memory. This is why the repetition feels automatic. It is not chosen, it arises. What deepens suffering is not the appearance of these thoughts, but the meaning assigned to them. When a thought appears, the mind often says, "This must mean something," or "This shouldn't still be happening," or "I should be past this by now." Zen teaches that these secondary reactions tighten the knot. They transform a simple mental habit into a personal story of failure or weakness. In truth, nothing has gone wrong. The mind is simply continuing a movement it has not yet been taught to release. Zen does not ask you to stop the repetition. It asks you to observe it without interference. When a thought returns and is met with stillness rather than resistance, something subtle begins to change. The mind starts to recognize that the image no longer delivers what it once promised. It sees through direct experience that replaying the past does not restore peace. This realization cannot be forced or rushed. It arrives quietly through patient awareness. As this understanding deepens, the repetition slowly loses its urgency. Thoughts may still appear, but they begin to feel thinner, less demanding, less convincing. The mind starts to learn that it can exist without recreating what has ended. And in this learning, a new pattern is formed, one not based on grasping or avoidance, but on acceptance of impermanence as a natural condition of life. When this shift occurs, it does not feel dramatic. There is no sudden disappearance of memory. Instead, there is a gentle release, as if the mind has finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. This is not forgetting, it is understanding. And understanding, in Zen, is the beginning of freedom. Why peace ends the moment clinging begins. When the mind begins to understand that repetition is habit and not destiny, a more subtle truth reveals itself. Peace does not vanish because something ends. Peace vanishes because the mind quietly refuses to allow endings to be what they are. In Zen psychology, suffering is not caused by change itself, but by the tension created when the mind argues with change. The moment clinging begins, the mind divides reality into two worlds. One world is what is happening now, and the other is what should still be happening. The mind then leans away from the present and toward the remembered or imagined past. This leaning is almost imperceptible at first, but it creates a constant strain, like holding a door closed against a wind that never stops blowing. Peace cannot remain in a mind that is continuously bracing itself against reality. Clinging is often misunderstood as intense desire or emotional desperation, but Zen teaches that clinging is usually quiet and polite. It hides behind thoughts that sound reasonable, such as hoping things could return to how they were, replaying conversations to find meaning, or believing that closure will one day arrive through understanding. These thoughts appear harmless, but they subtly communicate to the mind that the present moment is insufficient. Once this message is accepted, peace withdraws, not as punishment, but because it cannot coexist with resistance. In Buddhist psychology, peace arises when the mind rests in what is. The moment the mind demands that reality be different, it steps out of harmony with the natural flow of change. This is why even pleasant memories can become a source of suffering. The memory itself is neutral, but the clinging to it creates longing, and longing creates tension. The mind becomes divided, living partly in memory and partly in the present, fully settled in neither. As clinging deepens, the body begins to participate. The breath shortens, the chest tightens, sleep becomes lighter, and silence becomes uncomfortable. The mind then interprets these sensations as evidence that something is wrong, reinforcing the urge to hold on even more tightly. This creates a self-sustaining cycle in which clinging produces unrest, and unrest is used to justify further clinging. Zen calls this the wheel of suffering, not because it is dramatic, but because it turns quietly and continuously. What ends this cycle is not effort, but recognition. When the mind clearly sees that peace did not leave because of loss, but because of resistance, a subtle shift occurs. The mind begins to soften its grip, not because it is forced to, but because it understands that holding on is what creates the pain it seeks to escape. This understanding is not intellectual. It is felt in the body as a gradual easing, a willingness to allow the present moment to be complete without reference to what came before. Zen teaches that the present moment does not need improvement. It only needs permission to exist without comparison. When this permission is given, even briefly, peace reappears naturally. It does not arrive with excitement or relief. It arrives quietly, like still water settling after being disturbed. The mind does not become empty, but it becomes honest, no longer pretending that something missing is required for wholeness. As this understanding deepens, clinging loses its authority. Thoughts may still arise, but they are no longer believed without question. The mind learns that it can remember without grasping and reflect without resisting. In this learning, peace stops being something to recover and becomes something that was never truly lost, only obscured by the effort to hold on. How clinging quietly shapes the entire mind. As the mind begins to recognize that peace ends not because something leaves, but because clinging quietly begins, it enters a more subtle territory of understanding. At this stage, suffering no longer feels sharp or dramatic. Instead, it feels constant, low, and persistent, like a background noise that never fully disappears. Zen psychology explains that this is the most difficult form of suffering to recognize because it disguises itself as normal thinking, normal remembering, and normal concern. Clinging rarely announces itself clearly. It does not say, "I am clinging." It speaks in softer language. It says, "I'm just thinking." It says, "I'm only remembering." It says, "This matters to me." These thoughts seem harmless, even reasonable, yet they continuously pull the mind away from the simplicity of the present moment. Over time, the mind becomes accustomed to this movement and forgets that stillness was ever natural. In Buddhist psychology, the mind is compared to clear water. When untouched, it reflects reality accurately. When disturbed repeatedly, even gently, it becomes cloudy. Clinging is not a single disturbance, but a continuous stirring. Each remembered moment, each imagined future, each silent wish that things were different creates a small ripple. One ripple alone changes little, but thousands of ripples prevent the water from ever becoming still. As this process continues, the mind begins to build an identity around its clinging. It starts to believe that the thoughts are personal, that the suffering says something meaningful about who you are or what you lost. Zen teaches that this belief deepens attachment far more than the original experience ever could. The mind no longer clings only to a person or a moment. It clings to the story of itself as someone who has lost, someone who is incomplete, someone who must carry this memory forward. This is where many people unknowingly remain for years. Life continues outwardly. Responsibilities are met. Smiles appear. Conversations happen. Yet inwardly, the mind is slightly bent toward the past, slightly dissatisfied with the present, slightly waiting for something to resolve itself. Zen describes this as living halfway in reality and halfway in imagination. The body is here, but the mind is elsewhere, gently but constantly leaning away from now. Clinging also shapes how the mind experiences silence. When silence appears, the mind fills it immediately with memory. When stillness arrives, the mind interrupts it with thought. This is not because silence is dangerous, but because silence removes distraction, and distraction is what clinging uses to survive unnoticed. In silence, the mind begins to see its own movements clearly, and this clarity can feel uncomfortable at first. Zen psychology does not interpret this discomfort as a problem. It sees it as the first honest meeting between awareness and habit. When the mind is no longer occupied by external demands, it encounters the accumulated tension created by years of holding, expecting, resisting, and remembering. This tension is not personal. It is the natural result of misunderstanding impermanence. Impermanence is not a philosophical idea in Zen. It is a lived reality. Everything that arises changes. Everything that changes passes. When the mind forgets this truth, it begins to grasp. When it remembers this truth deeply, grasping loosens without effort. The suffering associated with clinging is not meant to punish, but to remind. It reminds the mind that it has mistaken something temporary for something permanent. As awareness deepens, the mind starts to notice that clinging does not only affect thoughts of one person or one experience. It affects how the mind approaches all of life. It clings to expectations, to outcomes, to identities, to versions of itself. It wants certainty in a world that does not offer it. It wants guarantees where none exist. This desire for certainty quietly fuels anxiety, restlessness, and dissatisfaction. Zen teaches that peace does not require certainty. Peace requires intimacy with uncertainty. When the mind stops demanding that life behave in predictable ways, it begins to relax its grip. This relaxation does not feel like giving up. It feels like setting down a weight that was carried for so long it was forgotten. The body responds first. The breath deepens. The shoulders soften. The chest loosens. The mind follows slowly, cautiously, learning that it does not need to guard itself against change. At this stage, thoughts may still arise about the past, but they no longer dominate awareness. They pass through like clouds rather than settling like fog. The mind no longer believes that thinking about something will resolve it. It begins to understand that clarity comes from presence, not repetition. This understanding changes the quality of attention. Attention becomes wider, softer, less urgent. Zen psychology emphasizes that letting go is not an action performed by the will. It is the natural result of seeing clearly. When the mind truly sees that clinging creates suffering and that release brings ease, it chooses release without force. This choice does not happen once. It happens moment by moment, quietly, gently, without ceremony. Over time, the mind learns to remain with experience as it unfolds, rather than retreating into memory or projection. It learns to allow feelings to arise and pass without labeling them as problems to solve. This is not indifference. It is intimacy without possession. It is care without grasping. It is presence without demand. As this way of being stabilizes, peace stops feeling fragile. It no longer depends on conditions aligning perfectly. It remains even when thoughts arise, even when memories appear, even when emotions move through the body. Peace becomes less of a feeling and more of a spaciousness that allows all feelings to exist without conflict. Zen teaches that this is not a special state reserved for monks or mystics. It is the mind's natural condition when it is no longer divided against itself. When clinging dissolves, the mind returns to simplicity. It does not become empty of experience. It becomes free of struggle. By the time this understanding settles, something subtle but profound has changed. You may still remember, you may still care, but you no longer need the memory to complete you. You no longer need the past to justify the present. The mind rests more often, not because life has become perfect, but because resistance has quietly faded. This is the beginning of real peace in Zen. Not a peace that avoids pain, but a peace that no longer argues with reality. Not a peace that depends on holding, but a peace that emerges when holding ends. How the mind finally learns to release without force. When the mind has clearly seen how clinging shapes suffering and how resistance quietly pushes peace away, it reaches a turning point that Zen describes not as an achievement, but as a soft surrender. This surrender does not feel dramatic. There is no sudden realization, no emotional breakthrough, no moment where everything collapses and disappears. Instead, there is a gradual unwinding, as if a tightly wound thread is finally allowed to loosen at its own pace. At this stage, the mind begins to notice something important. It sees that clinging has always been an attempt to protect itself. The mind did not hold on because it was greedy or weak. It held on because it believed holding on was necessary for safety. Somewhere along the way, the mind learned that certain people, moments, or feelings provided stability, and it quietly decided that losing them would mean losing balance. This belief was never questioned. It was simply assumed. Zen psychology teaches that the mind does not release what it still believes it needs. As long as the mind believes that peace depends on a memory, a person, or a past experience, it will continue to return to it, even when doing so creates pain. Release begins only when the mind sees, through direct experience, that clinging does not actually deliver what it promises. This seeing cannot be rushed. It unfolds naturally through observation. As awareness deepens, the mind starts to notice the subtle cost of clinging. It notices how every return to the past slightly drains the present. It notices how replaying memories does not bring comfort, but leaves a faint residue of dissatisfaction. It notices how longing tightens the body, disturbs the breath, and narrows attention. These observations are not judgments. They are simple recognitions, and in Zen, recognition is what transforms habit. The mind also begins to see that letting go does not mean losing something valuable. This is one of the deepest misunderstandings clinging creates. The mind fears that release equals emptiness, meaninglessness, or emotional numbness. Zen reveals the opposite. Release does not empty life. It opens it. What disappears is not love, memory, or care, but the tension that distorted them. What remains is a quieter, more spacious relationship with experience. At this point, thoughts may still arise about the past, but the relationship to them changes. The mind no longer rushes toward them or pushes them away. It allows them to appear and dissolve without commentary. This neutrality is not coldness, it is balance. The mind begins to trust that it does not need to interfere with every mental movement. It learns that awareness itself is enough. Zen psychology explains that this trust is what the mind was seeking all along. Not reassurance from memory, not comfort from repetition, but trust in its own capacity to remain present without collapsing. Once this trust is felt, even briefly, clinging weakens. The mind realizes it can survive change. It can endure endings. It can exist without recreating the past. This realization is often accompanied by a subtle grief. Not the sharp grief of loss, but a quieter grief for how long the mind believed it needed to suffer. This grief is not a setback. It is part of healing. It marks the moment when the mind stops fighting impermanence and begins to accept it fully. Zen teaches that acceptance does not mean approval. It means allowing reality to be what it is, without argument. As acceptance deepens, the mind stops asking certain questions. It stops asking why things happened the way they did. It stops searching for meaning in endings. It stops waiting for closure. These questions fall away, not because they were answered, but because they are no longer needed. The mind no longer feels incomplete without answers. It rests in not knowing. In this resting, a new quality of peace appears. It is not the peace of pleasure or satisfaction. It is the peace of non-interference. Life continues to move. Feelings still arise. Thoughts still pass through. But there is no longer a sense that something must be held, fixed, or restored. The mind is no longer leaning toward or away from experience. It stands upright in the present. Zen describes this state as simplicity returning. The mind becomes less interested in stories and more intimate with direct experience. The sound of breathing, the sensation of sitting, the movement of light and shadow become sufficient. Not because the mind is forcing itself to be mindful, but because it no longer needs distraction to escape discomfort. Comfort arises naturally when resistance fades. Over time, this way of being stabilizes. The mind still remembers, but it no longer identifies with memory. It still cares, but it no longer clings. It still feels, but it no longer tightens around feeling. The energy once used to hold on becomes available for presence. Life feels lighter, not because it is easier, but because the mind is no longer carrying unnecessary weight. Zen psychology emphasizes that this release is not permanent in the sense of never being challenged again. Old habits may return under stress. Memories may resurface unexpectedly, but now the mind recognizes these movements for what they are. It does not panic. It does not conclude that something has gone wrong. It simply returns to awareness again and again, each time with less struggle. Eventually, the mind understands something profound through lived experience rather than belief. Peace was never something to achieve. It was never something to recover. It was the natural state that appears when clinging ceases. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. Only the misunderstanding needs to fall away. When this understanding settles, even partially, the question of why you could not stop thinking about them loses its urgency. The mind no longer needs to explain itself. It no longer needs to justify its past attachments. It sees them as part of learning, part of conditioning, part of being human. There is no self-criticism, only clarity. This clarity does not announce itself loudly. It feels like quiet relief, like space opening where tension once lived, like the mind finally trusting life enough to stop holding its breath. In Zen, this is considered true freedom. Not freedom from memory, but freedom from suffering created by memory. Not freedom from attachment entirely, but freedom from being ruled by it. And in this freedom, peace does not feel fragile. It feels grounded. It does not depend on conditions. It remains even as life changes, even as people come and go, even as experiences rise and fall. The mind has learned its most important lesson. It does not need to cling in order to be whole. When understanding settles and the mind stops returning, after the mind has learned how release happens without force, a quieter phase begins. This phase is not dramatic, and because of that, it is often overlooked. Zen psychology teaches that insight alone does not end suffering. What ends suffering is when insight settles deeply enough to change how the mind moves through ordinary moments. This settling is gradual, almost invisible, yet it is where real freedom takes root. At this stage, the mind no longer feels desperate to resolve the past, but traces of old habits still appear. Thoughts arise softly, sometimes unexpectedly, like echoes in an empty space. What has changed is not the appearance of thought, but the response to it. The mind does not rush forward, it does not follow the echo. It simply notices, and in noticing, the echo fades on its own. Zen describes this as the mind learning to trust stillness. Earlier, stillness felt unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because it exposed the restless movements created by clinging. Now stillness begins to feel natural again. The mind no longer needs to fill silence with memory or explanation. It rests more often in simple awareness, not because it is trying to be calm, but because it no longer feels threatened by openness. This is an important shift. The mind realizes that peace is not something fragile that must be protected. It is resilient. It can remain present even when thoughts arise, even when emotions move, even when memories pass through. The fear that once drove clinging slowly dissolves. The mind sees that it can experience change without losing itself. As this trust grows, the mind becomes less interested in controlling experience. It stops scanning the present for reminders of the past. It stops measuring moments against what once was. Instead, it meets each moment as it appears, without comparison. Zen teaches that comparison is one of the most subtle forms of clinging. When comparison fades, contentment becomes possible. At this stage, emotional reactions soften, feelings still arise, but they no longer demand immediate interpretation. Sadness may appear without turning into self-pity. Warmth may appear without turning into attachment. Even joy is experienced differently, not grasped or feared, but allowed to move naturally. The mind learns to let experiences come and go without building identity around them. The body responds to this shift as well. Breathing becomes deeper without effort. Sleep becomes more natural. Silence no longer feels empty. There is a sense of being at home in oneself that does not depend on external reassurance. Zen psychology explains that this sense of inner stability was always available, but it was obscured by the constant movement of grasping and resisting. One of the clearest signs that understanding has settled is that the mind stops asking certain questions altogether. It no longer asks why things unfolded the way they did. It no longer asks whether something should have lasted longer. It no longer asks when peace will finally arrive. These questions dissolve because the mind no longer believes that answers will complete it. In this space, something subtle but profound happens. The mind begins to experience compassion differently. Earlier, compassion may have been entangled with attachment or expectation. Now, compassion arises without demand. There is kindness toward oneself without indulgence, and kindness toward others without clinging. Zen teaches that true compassion is spacious. It does not bind. It allows. As this compassion stabilizes, the mind also becomes more forgiving, not as a moral act, but as a natural consequence of clarity. It sees that most suffering arises from misunderstanding rather than intention. It sees that others cling as it once did, searching for safety where none can permanently be found. This understanding softens judgment and reduces inner conflict. The mind also becomes more patient with itself. When old thoughts resurface, they are not treated as failures. They are recognized as remnants of conditioning that are losing strength. Zen psychology emphasizes that habits weaken through non-participation, not through suppression. Each time a thought arises and is not fed, it loses momentum. Over time, it fades naturally. This phase requires no special practice. It is not maintained by effort or discipline. It is sustained by clarity. The mind has learned through experience that clinging brings tension and release brings ease. It chooses ease not as a strategy, but as a natural preference. Just as the hand releases something hot without instruction, the mind releases what it recognizes as painful. Gradually, the mind stops orienting itself around absence. It no longer defines itself by what is missing or what has ended. Identity becomes lighter, less fixed. The sense of self is no longer tied to stories of loss or attachment. It becomes fluid, responsive, grounded in the present moment rather than anchored in memory. Zen describes this as living without leaning. The mind is no longer leaning toward the past or reaching for the future. It stands in the present without tension. This does not mean life becomes passive or dull. On the contrary, experience becomes more vivid because attention is no longer divided. Ordinary moments are met fully, without distraction or resistance. In this way, peace becomes stable, not because life has stopped changing, but because the mind has stopped arguing with change. Even when difficulties arise, there is a baseline of calm that remains accessible. Suffering may still appear, but it no longer defines the mind's landscape. It passes through without leaving deep marks. Eventually, the original question loses its power altogether. The question of why you could not stop thinking about them no longer matters. The mind understands that it was never about them. It was about learning how attachment works and how release happens. Once the lesson is integrated, the mind moves on naturally, without ceremony or closure. Zen teaches that this is how awakening unfolds in everyday life. Not through sudden enlightenment, but through the gradual falling away of misunderstanding. Not through dramatic change, but through quiet alignment with reality. The mind becomes simpler, softer, and more honest. In this simplicity, peace does not feel like an achievement. It feels ordinary. It feels like returning to something familiar that was never truly lost. The mind no longer seeks peace as an object. It lives from it as a foundation. This is the stabilization Zen points to. A mind that remembers without clinging, feels without tightening, and lives without resisting. A mind that has learned through direct experience that it does not need to hold on in order to be whole. When nothing needs to be held anymore. At the final stage of understanding, the mind no longer feels as though it has reached something new. Instead, it feels as though it has stopped doing something unnecessary. Zen psychology teaches that freedom is not gained by acquiring insight, but by releasing the habits that obscured clarity. When this release completes itself naturally, the mind rests without effort, without commentary, and without searching. By now, the mind has seen through the illusion that peace depended on another person, another moment, or another version of life. It has also seen through the illusion that clinging was an act of love or loyalty. What remains is a simple awareness that experiences arise, pass, and leave no obligation behind. The mind no longer asks what should have stayed or what should have ended differently. Those questions no longer appear meaningful. At this stage, memory still exists, but it is no longer heavy. It no longer pulls attention backward or asks the mind to recreate what has passed. Memory becomes like a reflection on water, visible but without substance. It appears and disappears without disturbing the surface. Zen describes this as remembering without inhabiting, knowing without holding. The mind also notices a subtle but profound change in how it experiences time. Earlier, time felt stretched by longing and compressed by resistance. Now time feels spacious. Moments are no longer rushed or delayed by internal conflict. The present moment no longer feels like a bridge between what was and what might be. It feels complete on its own. This completeness does not come from satisfaction or pleasure. It comes from non-division. The mind is no longer split between acceptance and resistance, between remembering and returning. It rests fully in what is happening now, even when what is happening is ordinary, quiet, or unresolved. Zen teaches that this is the deepest form of peace, because it does not depend on circumstances aligning in a particular way. At this point, the mind also understands something important about effort. Earlier, effort was used to fix, change, or improve experience. Now, effort is replaced by attentiveness. The mind no longer tries to become peaceful. It notices when peace is already present and when it is being disturbed by unnecessary holding. This noticing is gentle and immediate. There is no judgment, only awareness. In this awareness, even subtle forms of clinging become visible. The mind may notice small preferences, mild aversions, or quiet expectations arising, but instead of reacting to them, it allows them to dissolve naturally. Zen psychology emphasizes that when awareness is steady, clinging cannot sustain itself. It fades not because it is fought, but because it is seen clearly. The sense of self also becomes lighter. The mind no longer defines itself through stories of attachment, loss, or longing. Identity becomes less fixed and more responsive. There is a feeling of openness, as if the boundaries that once separated inner experience from outer life have softened. Life is no longer something the mind stands apart from and evaluates. It is something the mind participates in fully. This participation is not dramatic or intense. It is quiet and intimate. Ordinary activities are experienced more directly. Walking feels like walking. Breathing feels like breathing. Listening feels like listening. Zen teaches that when the mind is no longer preoccupied with holding or resisting, it returns to simplicity. This simplicity is not emptiness. It is fullness without grasping. Compassion deepens naturally at this stage. The mind recognizes the universality of clinging and suffering. It sees how easily confusion arises and how deeply habits shape experience. This recognition softens the heart without making it vulnerable to attachment. There is care without expectation, understanding without indulgence, and kindness without self-sacrifice. The mind also becomes more forgiving of itself. It no longer judges past attachment as weakness or failure. It sees attachment as part of learning how impermanence works. There is no need to rewrite the past or reinterpret it. The past is allowed to be exactly what it was, without needing to justify or condemn it. Zen describes this as reconciliation without explanation. As this reconciliation settles, the mind no longer feels compelled to revisit old questions. It does not ask why something happened or what it was meant to teach. The experience has already completed its function. It has shown the mind where it was clinging and how release occurs. Once the lesson is integrated, the mind naturally turns its attention back to life as it is now. Peace at this stage does not feel fragile or temporary. It is not threatened by memory or emotion. It remains even when difficulty arises. This does not mean suffering never appears again, but it means suffering no longer takes over the entire field of awareness. It passes through like weather, leaving the underlying clarity intact. Zen psychology describes this as living without remainder. Nothing is carried forward unnecessarily. Each moment is met, experienced, and released. The mind no longer accumulates emotional residue. It learns to complete experiences as they end, without dragging them into the next moment. This completion is not deliberate. Eventually, the original struggle feels distant, not because it has been erased, but because it no longer defines the present. The mind remembers that there was a time when thoughts returned compulsively, when peace felt inaccessible, when attachment felt unavoidable, but this memory carries no weight. It is simply part of the path that led here. Zen teaches that awakening is not becoming someone new. It is ceasing to be someone burdened by misunderstanding. When misunderstanding falls away, the mind returns to its natural clarity. Nothing is added. Nothing is missing. Life continues, but it is lived without the constant effort to hold it together. In this final integration, the mind no longer needs reassurance. It no longer needs to be told that things will be okay. It has learned, through experience, that it can meet whatever arises without clinging or collapse. This confidence is quiet. It does not announce itself. It is simply present. This is where the journey ends, not with answers, but with stillness, not with certainty, but with trust, not with closure, but with openness. The mind rests because there is nothing left to grasp and nothing left to resist. And in this resting, peace does not appear as something special or extraordinary. It appears as the natural state that remains when clinging ends, the state that was always here, waiting patiently beneath every attempt to hold on. If your mind has grown quiet while listening, there is nothing you need to do with that quiet. Zen teaches that peace does not arrive from effort. It remains when effort ends. You were never meant to erase memory. You were never meant to force yourself forward. You were only meant to see clearly, and in seeing clearly, to stop holding what was never yours to keep. Thoughts may still visit, feelings may still rise, but now you know they do not need an answer. They do not need a story. They only need space to pass. Let this understanding settle gently, not as an idea, but as a way of being. When clinging ends, peace does not begin. Peace simply returns. Remain here for a moment longer. Breathe without seeking. Rest without holding.